after the four panelists have given their given their initial presentations, I'm happy to moderate and include your questions. So why, just a brief note about why we wanted to do this event. Washington Office on Latin America, which is, we're principally a foreign policy human rights organization, but we have done a lot of work at the US-Mexico border for about 11 years now. In our history, which is almost a 50-year history, we've monitored a lot of human rights abuses committed, monitored and acted to get justice on a lot of human rights abuses committed by security forces around the region, from the dictatorships of the 1970s, the death squads of the 1980s, abuses committed by intelligence forces in Cuba and elsewhere, the drug war, Colombia, Mexico, on and on and on. We started working on the border in 2011 and found that, similar types of abuses were being committed by our own border law enforcement agencies, Customs and Border Protection and Border Patrol, and more troublingly, with a similar degree of impunity, a similar degree of difficulty for victims to actually get any justice or redress for what was done to them at the border. Those victims can be migrants. They can also be US citizens sometimes. So finding these patterns, both, serious abuses, but also a lot of sort of everyday abuses, ranging from abusive language to the conditions in custody, denial of medical care, denial of the right to asylum and other things. It seems familiar. We came a bit late to this. A lot of groups had already been doing this documentation at the border for a while, especially groups at the border who are day-to-day living alongside these law enforcement agencies. All we've done really the past couple of years is try to systematize what we're hearing. We've built a database online. It's called borderoversight.org, where we have over 300 cases so far since 2020 of news that's come to us from partners at the border and from just the media about incidents that have really troubled us. And it's listed by categories of abuse committed, where the abuse happened, what units were involved, characteristics of the victims. But also, one of the parts that's been hardest to sort of document is, what was the last known step taken to hold those accountable for what happened? Was the complaints process? Was there any justice or redress done? Did investigations just kind of stop? And frankly, we're not seeing a lot of progress there. So that's the why of this event. We want to talk about what's going on and why the process seems to be broken when it comes to accountability. I just want to make clear before I hand off to the speakers that we're not trying to attack Border Patrol agents or CBP officers. There's a lot of people who got into this job because they want to do good, and they're important members of their community, but there is a problem. It seems to go beyond bad apples. It seems to go beyond actually taking good people and an institution actually doing something to them through its organizational culture once they're in. And that culture seems to be being reinforced on a daily basis. So what's going on here? So I'm delighted that we've got four partners here who agreed to participate in this event today to discuss and explain the challenges that they face in their work, seeking accountability for abuse at the border. Two of them are Washington-based organizations like us, and two plus Jenny's organization really makes three are organizations that do work directly at the border. So I'm going to go in an order. We'll have Shaw go first, Shaw Drake from the ACLU, followed by Zoe Martins from the Kino Border Initiative in Nogales, followed by Jenny Johnson from the Southern Border Communities Coalition, and then finally Sarah Turberville from the Project on Government Oversight. So Shaw, just to introduce him, he joined the ACLU National recently, but the ACLU Border Rights Center in 2018. He's based in El Paso, where I believe he is right now, and he really is just an incredible resource. He actively records allegations of abuse. He files regular complaints, an amazing source of information, and a source of litigation and advocacy as well. He's a graduate of Georgetown University Law Center. He clerked for a federal judge in New York and worked at Human Rights First before joining ACLU Border Rights Center in 2018. It feels like you've been in the community even longer. It feels like you've been around since at least the Obama years, but I guess not. But Shaw, it's great to have you here, and I'd love to hear it'd be great to hear from you. The microphone is yours.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks everyone for joining us in this important discussion today. I'll try to keep my comments short and to the point, and really look forward and encourage people thinking about questions as we're talking through, and hope we can engage in a discussion on the latter end of our time together. I'll start by giving a bit of an overview of what the accountability system within CBP and DHS looks like, where the gaps are that we've identified and the issues, and then talk a little bit about the litany of abuses and administrative complaints we filed, and some of our attempts to bring accountability through utilizing these, albeit broken, systems, and also trying to strengthen some of them. So, I often talk about the accountability mechanisms within DHS and CBP as this dysfunctional mosaic of offices that are kind of ping-ponging the ball between each other, each play a separate role and do slightly a separate task, but they all kind of fail, I think, at the end of the day in producing real meaningful accountability. And ultimately what we're all seeking is changes in culture, in activity, and limiting these incidents from occurring to begin with. And so you have a few main offices. You have the Office of Inspector General, you have the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, which I know a colleague will talk more in detail about, excuse me. And then you have the Office of Professional Responsibility within CBP. So really, in broad strokes, the Office of Inspector General is more of an independent office, not subject to the same kind of chain of command reporting within the department. Mainly what you see come out of that office is broader ranging reports, often on the heels of a lot of political pressure to even have them undertake an investigation and a report. And those reports include recommendations to the agency, but of course the agency is under no obligation to institute any of those recommendations, and oftentimes disputes the findings and provides comments on their opinion about the recommendations, but there's really no ability to force them. Some of those reports are useful, of course, in down the road advocacy, but it's really limited. CRCL, the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office, really focuses on policy, gaps in policy within the agency, ways in which policy that are currently on the books may not be aligned with the law or with protecting people's civil and human rights. But again, at the end of the day, that office issues internal recommendations. Most of the time, people who have filed complaints with the office don't receive a readout of what those recommendations or what the finding of their investigation were. And then again, the agency internally, especially because those recommendations are, unlike the Inspector General reports, are not made public, it's even harder to follow up on those, to force the agency to adopt them, or to even pressure them into commenting on why they have or haven't. And then the third is the Office of Professional Responsibility. This is more of like an internal affairs office. It's the office that's supposed to hold agents individually accountable for misconduct. They are, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, they are federal criminal investigators. They've been given that authority by Congress. And so the results of their internal investigations can result in criminal charges, prosecution being brought against officers for violating the law, and it has in some occasions. But they also issue essentially recommendations about, or findings from their investigations about that inform potential disciplinary action, but they don't actually have the authority to issue disciplinary measures. That goes to a even more convoluted internal and non-transparent system of a disciplinary board. It oftentimes goes through sector leadership, meaning that the supervisors and bosses of the individual agent who has done something wrong get a chance to make their own decisions about what discipline is sought against the agent. Of course, a conflict of interest there, because no supervisor looks good when their agents below them are being doled out extensive disciplinary measures. So that's kind of the broad overview. We at the ACLU have done a few things in trying to utilize those systems and for what they're worth. During the Trump years, we did a lot of filing of administrative complaints, which were really, I viewed as a mechanism for documenting and putting on some form of official record the massive abuses of CBP during the Trump administration. So we actually filed 13 different complaints over a 2-year period between 2018 and 2020. Those included hundreds of cases of misconduct. They were kind of grouped into themes. One was on the lack of medical care and appropriate treatment of children in custody. One on the treatment of pregnant people in custody. One which was kind of one of its kind when we filed it. I had never seen something put together like this, but it's such a common report of misconduct. It was just verbal abuse, and so we did an entire complaint just pulling from hundreds and hundreds of interviews of migrants who had gone through CBP custody, documenting the ways in which Border Patrol and CBP personnel verbally abused them throughout their time in detention. Those 13 complaints during the Trump administration kind of unsurprisingly went unaddressed and unresponded to, even not even getting back kind of confirmation that we got your complaint letters from some of those oversight agencies that I mentioned previously. And under the Biden administration, we kind of re-upped those complaints in a letter to Mayorkas in the early days of the administration, and did get more engagement from them, at least confirming that investigations have been conducted into some of our complaints. But again, very little transparency about what the outcomes of those investigations were. Similar to some kind of other efforts by other groups, but certainly not as extensive as WOLA's effort to document misconduct allegations, but the ACLU does maintain a fatal encounters tracker, specifically focusing on fatal incidents of people that have come into contact with the agency. Unfortunately, this is relying on publicly available information. The agency does not consistently provide extensive data or information into specific incidents, and so sometimes it's a little bit of a guessing game as to what exactly happened in an incident and how to categorize it. But part of that effort led us to realize that in just the last 2 or 3 years, there has been a massive increase in the number of deaths as a result of vehicle pursuits being conducted by Border Patrol. Actually, an 11-fold increase between 2019, when we documented just 2 deaths resulting from such pursuits, 11 times that, and up into 2021, there was 23 recorded deaths. And this year, we're still on track for this to be the deadliest year. I believe we've surpassed it, and this is already the deadliest year on record of deaths resulting from vehicle pursuits. So we have engaged specifically on a few of those cases that I'll touch on just briefly. One in New Mexico, where the agency issued a typically kind of very vague and honestly sketchy press release about what happened in an incident that ended up killing 2 people, one a U.S. citizen and one a migrant from Ecuador. And we investigated that case. We filed Public Information Act requests with local law enforcement agencies, because you rarely get anything from FOIA requests to CBP, although we did file a FOIA request to CBP that still hasn't been responded to. And through that, we received internal investigation documents, particularly one from something called the critical incident teams that I know Jenny will speak about more in depth later in the panel. But these are essentially internal investigation teams, Border Patrol agents investigating themselves. And the investigation report was, by all standards, inadequate. It had inconsistencies within it. It lacked basic information about tracking evidence collection, about what vehicles were involved in the pursuit, raised a host of questions. And then audio that we received from, again, local dispatch in New Mexico revealed that that immediately after the crash, it was being discussed over radio as Border Patrol clipping the vehicle, when of course in their press release, they simply said, oh, well, we were just chasing the vehicle and it lost control going at a high speed and crashed itself. So obviously that's the key element as to whether the agency is specifically responsible for a use of force as opposed to a vehicle pursuit. So this This work has also included focusing on making transparent policies within the agency so that we can hold the agency accountable for those policies. The vehicle pursuit is a perfect example of that. For years, our demand was that the agency simply release what their policy is. And then finally they did in 2019. Unsurprisingly, it is extremely problematic, and we've issued recommendations and secured from them a promise that they are in fact currently rewriting that policy to be more focused on public safety. I'll just say, and I know I'm running out of time or I'm over time, but the Office of Professional Responsibility, I think, is one place for all of us to put extra attention, particularly over these next 2 years while we still have the Biden administration. The Office of Professional Responsibility was granted in 2016 by legislation the authority to be federal criminal investigators. Along with that came a number of requirements that the office is still not in compliance with. One of them, keyly including, is something called feedback. So they're required to give feedback to complainants stemming from that legislation, and they still don't have policies on the books to do that. And so now but they have committed to us and other organizations that they intend to institute policies that better provide feedback to complainants about the outcome of their investigations. And so I think taking advantage of that moment and hopefully setting up a system whereby, in the future, complaints that are filed with OPR get at least some indication of how they were investigated, what the investigation found, what outcomes came from those investigations. And that would certainly put all of us in a stronger position to advocate for more meaningful accountability within the agency. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
That was a great introduction to the accountability arrangements that exist. Thank you, Shah. And I'm going to turn the microphone over to Zoe Martins from the Kino Border Initiative, based in both Nogales, Arizona, and Sonora. Kino, or KBI, is a past recipient of the WOLA Human Rights Award. It is a Jesuit-run organization that manages at least one now kitchen and shelter on the Nogales side of the border. But they also, when they do their intakes, when they hear about what happens to migrants, they really make a note of it. And they're a huge source of really troubling, often source of information about what's happening there. Zoe joined Kino KBI this year, and is now advocacy director there. She had this is after having a Fulbright that for which she worked in Tlaxcala, Mexico. Then in southern Mexico, she also spent a stint working with the Institute for Women in Migration, IMUMI, in Mexico, an excellent organization. And Zoe, I'll hand off the microphone to you. Thanks for joining us today. So
awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Shah. That was a great introduction, and I hope I can be as concise and clear as you. I am going to share the screen. We're all talking about this struggle. I think I should be able to do it no problem. So I will get this all set up. All right, we should be good. So this will help keep me on track here to have some slides. But as Adam said, my name is Zoe Martins. I'm advocacy coordinator at Kino Border Initiative. We are based in ambos Nogales, in both Nogales, but the bulk of our work does happen on the Sonora side. So I just wanted to start with this as a photo from a recent march that migrants organized in Nogales, Sonora, drawing attention to different priorities that we have right now. Access to asylum always is an ongoing struggle, as we all know, with the continuation and expansion of Title 42. Migrants are also speaking out about access to basic resources in Nogales, Sonora, as many people are stuck waiting in Sonora for their process in the US. Access to education, healthcare, and dignified living conditions. And then another thing that was highlighted in the march was CBP abuses in particular Border Patrol. So as Adam introduced, we are a Catholic and Jesuit organization in Sonora. We've been working there since about 2006 and officially founded in 2010. And our work has different aspects. Absolutely, it's this direct humanitarian assistance that we provide to migrant people who are coming through in Nogales, Sonora. And we also work a lot with education and trying to provide opportunities for encounter between people who are migrating and others to really raise consciousness, to increase political will to change migration policies. And then kind of our third facet is this policy advocacy side, that we do advocacy both in the US and Mexico, trying to work towards these more humane and dignified migration policies, as I said. And so really the heart of all of those facets of our work is our encuesta, our intake survey that we do with everyone who arrives to KBI and receives our services. And I'm going to be talking about our experiences, particularly filing the CRCL complaints, so DHS Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. And all of that stems from a question that we have on our intake survey about if people have experienced abuse or some sort of violation of their rights in their migration journey. So that is kind of where this all begins for us at KBI. I'm going to attempt to change this. Okay, perfect. And so the answer to this question of have people experienced abuses in their journey is often yes. I'll explain this infographic here. It's from 2021. We're still working on our data from this year that I'll be sure to update you all with when we have it. But this is a visualization from last year of how many instances of abuse people reported. So it is broken down by gender here, why we have the two different colors. But if we look at Patrulla Fronteriza or Border Patrol, adding up both women and men who reported abuses, it's over 1,500 reports of abuses by Border Patrol in 2021. And we can see through the visualization that these circles are way larger than any other groups we have up here. We have organized mafia, organized crime. We have guias or coyotes, people who are helping you cross the desert. We have individuals, the National Guard in Mexico. So this just helps us visualize, the extent of the frequency of what's happening. And this is only what we hear at Kino. Obviously this is not fully representative of what people experience. But based on these numbers, we started in 2015 to file CRCL complaints with people who wish to file them, who wanted to document and speak out about the abuses that they faced from Border Patrol in particular, but any DHS agency will also have people who maybe come from ICE custody. But overall, the focus has been Border Patrol. And so since 2015 until now, we have been navigating this process and dealing with a lot of challenges and obstacles to accountability that Shaw talked about, and I'll continue to go into detail about. But just overall, a struggle to have transparent communication with CRCL about what's happening with these complaints that are filed, extremely long wait times to hear anything back, if we hear anything back at all in response to these individual complaints, and overall just a lack of investigation. In 2017, KBI did release a summary, a report of kind of the work from 2015 to 2017. So it was over a time period of about 16 months. And during that time, we had filed 49 complaints. And we were notified about the results of 13 of those complaints, 13 of 42 over that course of about a year and a half. So that's a report that we released called Intake Without Oversight back in 2017, first starting to document some of these challenges that we were seeing. And then more recently in 2021, Joanna, who is now our executive director, wrote a letter to Secretary Mayorkas, again, highlighting these patterns and trying to call attention to the inadequacy of the complaint process, speaking to how many complaints we had filed that were not responded to at all, or the many that were responded to, and the response was that the complaints had been recorded in the database, but that no further action was going to be taken. It's a very common response that we were getting and continue to get. So here are some questions that are in my mind, my coworkers' mind, right? Talking about this office, CRCL in particular. CRCL, as Shaw had said, reviews and assesses allegations that are about civil rights or civil liberties abuses within any DHS component. And they're also supposed to give kind of policy and legal advice to DHS about how they can better comply with civil rights and civil liberties. We have at KBI a unique perspective on this process as well, because we accompany people in filing their individual complaints. So we kind of walk through the CRCL process, exactly as CRCL says an individual complainant should do it. We also add on some extra advocacy steps that we've learned over the years, learned things about how to better navigate the system, how to try to increase the pressure to get a response. One thing I'll talk about a little bit more in a second is there's the Joint Intake Center is another kind of supposed to be a centralized clearinghouse for DHS complaints. So we've learned that when we send a CRCL complaint via email, we also CC the DHS Joint Intake Center right away, so we know it's going to both places. But that's something, for example, that we've learned over years of advocacy, that an individual complainant might not have access to that information, that's a helpful step to try to get a response to your complaint. So as I said, we've learned some about how to navigate this system, but we see this system as one that really disempowers individual complainants, and that's a big issue. So our ongoing questions, are what is CRCL doing both about the individual complaints that they're receiving, and what are they doing about the patterns of abuse that are emerging through individual complaints? Because both of these things would fall under CRCL's purview, issuing some sort of response to individuals, and then through looking at those complaints, starting some investigations, speaking out about the patterns that emerge. When I file, or when I offer to file a complaint with someone, I try to be really clear that there's no personal benefit to them. They might not ever receive an individualized response to their personal experience, but that the idea is it contributes to documentation. As Shah had alluded to, it contributes to documenting a pattern that CRCL would ideally then be able to see and be able to use to issue recommendations and to influence policy, so that these same things don't continue happening. But it's still unclear to us to what extent either of these things are happening, to what extent CRCL is doing things about individual complaints, and to what extent they're responding to the patterns of abuse. And then the second kind of bullet point question I have up here is about the experience of individual complainants. How are they able to connect their personal experiences to these patterns of abuse that CRCL is looking out for? As I said, one of the common responses we get is that the complaint was recorded in the database, but we don't know in what way is that informing pattern of abuse investigations, or what is the impact of that individual complaint. And so that's a concern that we have, because how would an individual complainant ever know that them taking the time to relive this abuse, to write it down in a detailed way, actually contributes to an investigation, or actually contributes to potential policy change, as I'm saying it should. So we want to be able to offer a genuine channel to people to be reporting the abuses they experience, but there's a lot of uncertainty about what impact this is having, and individual complainants don't really know. So these are some ongoing questions and doubts. Shah also set the stage for this really nicely, right? So like, what is the system of accountability? Who's in charge of what kind of investigation? This is just, this is not an exhaustive list, because Jenny will also talk about critical incident teams and some other agencies that are supposed to be involved in accountability. But this is a big issue. There's a lot of overlapping agencies with similar mandates, and cases are shuffled around. This is what we see a lot. It's unclear to us from the outside kind of what goes where, who takes what, and we've heard from some people within DHS agencies that's confusing to them too, and that this is a real struggle. And the more things get shuffled around, the longer these wait times are, the more you lose the window for a credible investigation, or that evidence is retained for a certain period of time. So this is a big struggle, this ping pong mosaic. I loved how Shah said it. So I think we already kind of have an overview of some of these agencies, right? We have CRCL, we have OIG, the Inspector General. And what I understand is that the CRCL complaints are all need to be sent to OIG first, because OIG has kind of the first right of refusal of if they want to investigate, if they want to take on the case or not. So this also slows the process down. If OIG declines, it's sent back to CRCL, and CRCL might then send it to OPR, because we often see that OPR is looking into the Border Patrol abuses that we document. And then we also have OIDO, which is a newer agency, the Immigration Detention Ombudsperson. who is focusing specifically on immigration detention conditions, both ICE detention and CBP or Border Patrol detention. We've started to CC them on some of our complaints as well, but it's kind of another agency added into this mix, and we're not sure how this is going to look, right? Is this going to be another bouncing around ping pong? Remains to be seen. This joint intake center that I also mentioned, this is a DHS intake center that's supposed to be really a centralized clearinghouse for all complaints, but there isn't a public facing accessible way to send things to the joint intake center. So this is something that we learned over the course of our advocacy, that now we CC them on our CRCL complaints. But there isn't really a way for the public to know that it would be useful to also send the complaints to joint intake center, because this could slow it down as well. You know, all the complaints are supposed to also go to the intake center. So if they're not sent there first, that'll be another step in the process. They have to be sent to joint intake center, also the OIG. So it's a mess. We've also heard some kind of anecdotes and personal experiences from OPR special agents, because we do have some communication with OPR agents on the field and locally where we work. And they had told us about some complaints of sexual assault in particular that they kind of learned about way far down the line, that they learned had been sitting on a desk somewhere precisely because of this, because they had to be sent to the joint intake center before they could then be forwarded to OPR for investigation. So this is also a big frustration for them. Okay, let's jump a little bit more into challenges that I've already alluded to. Also not an exhaustive list, but I just want to point out some patterns of challenges we see in CRCL in particular. Really long wait times to get any sort of response, right? And we can imagine a big part of this is the shuffling around. By the time it maybe gets to OPR, there might not be video evidence that exists anymore, or we might not have contact with the complainant because OPR usually reaches out to us asking for help to get back into touch with the person who filed the complaint. So for example, a wait time of 21 months, I'll give a specific example of a complaint that we helped to file that was from November 4th, 2020. Border Patrol expelled Camilo, a pseudonym I'm using, expelled Camilo to Mexico at 2 a.m. in the middle of the night. And then one agent in particular who was expelling this group of people said, "Where's that asshole?" And then approached Camilo, assuming, so we understand he was referring to him. And when Camilo asked, "Why am I being expelled?" The agent had his baton in his hand and threatened to hit him in the head with his baton. And then did strike him in the knee with his baton, which caused his knee to swell. He was having trouble walking afterwards, and then had to go sleep in the park downtown because he was expelled at 2 a.m. So we filed a complaint about this. We saw this as an inappropriate and excessive use of force, as well as verbal abuse and nighttime expulsions, other things that are happening at the same time. 21 months later, August 15th of this year, we received an email from an OPR agent who said he had received an investigation OIG did about this case, and they were looking to speak to Camilo. OIG said they weren't able to locate him or contact him, and that's one of the reasons they couldn't prosecute and move forward in this case. So they reached back out to us asking for help to get in contact with him. This is nearly 2 years later. We no longer have contact with this person. So what happens now? It stays there, I suppose. I also reached out to OIG because OPR said, if I wanted to know more about the OIG investigation, I could follow up with them. And they said a FOIA would be the next step. So just to give the overall picture of that case. Another common response, this complaint was recorded in our database and no further action will be taken. So we assume, or we like to think that, recording it in the database means this is informing some sort of pattern of abuse investigation down the line, but we really don't know. We don't know what happens. And so this is a response we have to get recorded, closed, end of story. Another response we have gotten is unable to substantiate these allegations, which brings up questions about kind of what does this investigation consist of? What evidence is being used? Who's being interviewed? And we know there's a lot of cases where complainants or victim survivors of these incidents are never interviewed. We saw this in Del Rio, and one of the most high profile cases of the people who actually experienced the abuse were never interviewed. So we have reason to believe that there are some inadequacies in the investigations. I'll give one more example here. This was also kind of a use of force case that we filed a complaint about. Again, I'll use a pseudonym, but this person, Mario, presented himself at the port of entry in Nogales, Sonora, because he was directly receiving threats in Nogales. He had also just barely escaped an attempted kidnapping, and so he fled to the port of entry to ask for protection. He fled near the area where cars were entering, and a group of 12 officers came to detain him. They all beat him with their hands and fists, and then expelled him to Mexico. Once he was in Mexico, the Mexican Red Cross came upon him and took him to the hospital due to these injuries. We filed the complaint, and we attached with the complaint photos of his injuries, which were scratches, some of which had stitches, bruises on multiple areas of his body. And the response was that OIG was unable to substantiate these allegations. So just, brings up those similar questions of what evidence is being considered here. Two other things I'll mention. There are also complaints that are closed due to related ongoing litigation, or complaints that are closed because CRCL has maybe admitted some recommendations that are related. We find a lot of complaints about due process violations, people who we believe should be passing kind of the shout test rule that apparently exists, that if people explicitly express that they fear torture, persecution in Mexico or to the place they would be expelled, that they should be channeled to some sort of process. And so we do file complaints about this. They've all been closed, citing that there's ongoing litigation related to this, Wisha in particular. And the complaint also says, if when the litigation is concluded, you still believe your complaints haven't been addressed, you can file another complaint. So just speaking again to how the system disempowers individual complainants, how do you expect someone to follow the Wisha litigation and then come back and file another complaint? So this is a big issue for us as well. And then about the CRCL recommendation. So this is also interesting. We have been receiving a lot of closed letters saying that, this is closed because CRCL made some recommendations in 2021. And these recommendations were about what this complaint is referring to, about humanitarian protections for people subject to Title 42. We didn't know what these recommendations were. They kept on just kind of saying like August 2021 recommendations. We got in contact with someone from the CRCL Community Engagement Office, and she directed us to redacted recommendations that they do have online, which we weren't aware of until now, but there are redacted recommendations available online. We read what we could in the redacted recommendation, and it did stem directly from a KVI complaint that was noted, right? So that's some sort of positive thing. It was noted in there. The recommendations were saying similar things to Wisha, that Border Patrol should use their discretion if people express fear of torture, persecution in the place they're going to be expelled to. They should be channeled to USCIS so that they can fully assess that fear. The recommendations also said CBP has 60 days to concur or not with these recommendations. We still don't know what their response is. As it says here, CRCL does not have any enforcement power. I mean, these are recommendations, and we still don't know what CBP said in particular to these recommendations. And one other thing I'll add, this individual complainant, kind of where these recommendations stem from, we need to try to get in touch with her. She still doesn't know that her taking the time and energy to file this complaint like directly resulted in these recommendations. So that goes back to, right, what do individual complainants kind of get out of this process? Where is the transparency and communication with them? Okay, I will zoom through. I have no idea how long I've been talking. This will just put up there. Okay, I'm wondering what's publicly available online. I would love to know how many complaints, CRCL complaints, Border Patrol, or here, Customs and Border Protection in general is getting. I would love to know how many result investigations, how many are immediately closed. It hasn't been updated since 2016. This is what's available online. Some really low numbers, 136 complaints over all of those years. it just surprises me because, you know, from KBI, I've been looking at our complaints from 2020 until today. And over those past like 2 years, we filed 72 complaints. So I'm like 136 over all these years. So just some more struggles to think about. You know, it takes a lot of time and energy to file the CRCL complaints, but we want these things to be documented. We want numbers that will get closer to representing the true frequency of these abuses. And I also want to recognize there's a lot of reasons that individual complaints don't want to file abuses, and that is absolutely valid. But it's important that we increase kind of capacity and funding for this work of documenting abuses so that people who want to use this channel are able to use this channel, and that these abuses are being documented. Okay, what can we do? These are my considerations. So like questions, recommendations. The first thing I'll say is just like, what is considered a serious or egregious abuse? What we have seen, we have gotten some in-person interviews with OPR special agents in response to our complaints. This is something that's super new. They used to not even try to make a phone call to complainants, but we've been doing local advocacy with our field office since like 2017, and we've gotten some in-person interviews where we know that they're interviewing the person. But these are only kind of in the most egregious cases of excessive use of force, et cetera. And at KBI, we also think that violations of due process, of deporting people to places where they're going to face torture and persecution, that's an egregious abuse as well. So it's just something that I'm thinking about, right? What kinds of investigations or complaints are really elevated and considered to be serious? When our pattern of abuse investigations opened, or what criteria the CRCL used to determine when there's a pattern. It seems that investigations are opened when NGOs push for them or request them, which is important work that NGOs are doing, but at the same time, there should be some internal system where CRCL, you know, automatically flags a pattern of abuse investigation when they've received X number of complaints about the same abuse, or, you know, some sort of internal system that we could understand when are these investigations triggered. And then this issue that I brought up of related ongoing investigation. You know, CRCL is part of DHS. They don't want to be collecting data against themselves during ongoing litigation. But what can be done about this issue? You know, how could CRCL continue to investigate parts of complaints, maybe that they consider less sensitive during ongoing litigation? But, you know, this kind of erases the possibility of investigation for a huge swath of complaints that we filed. How can we streamline the system? All these agencies that are overlapping, pushing paperwork back and forth. We at KBI feel that this is not an issue of creating more offices to do this work. And we wonder how this system can be made more effective. As I said, the challenge of everything having to be sent to OIG first before it could go to OPR to start an investigation. Is there a way that they could receive the information at the same time, or ways to streamline this system to deal with how long everything takes, really? And then the last two things I'll say, you know, kind of what can Congress do? How can Congress obligate more transparency in CRCL? Like I said, I would love to have access to some numbers online of how many complaints were filed. Can we break that down by abuse category, by sector, and can we have it every month? You know, this is something Congress could mandate, that we have access to that information, and it's something that we currently don't really know anything about. And Congress, you know, does focus on some high-profile cases, as they should, like the Del Rio investigation. But we think that Congress could be using this oversight power much more broadly. One other example is like there's the OPR discipline report that is made publicly available, but that report only reflects the cases that OPR has decided to open and investigate. That's not an exhaustive universe. So are there ways that we can get information about overall, you know, how many complaints, and have it broken down by these essential categories? And then lastly, this difficult question statement, but that I also wanted to put into the space, is how can DHS effectively investigate themselves? They ultimately decide the evidence they use, who to interview, what discipline or consequences are triggered, and what to even open in the first place. So these are some really challenging big questions, and I'm excited to hear what Jenny and Sarah have to say as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. That was a terrific presentation as well. I've learned so much, and I've written down so many questions. I don't even know which ones I'll choose, even if I get to ask. And if you don't want to hear Adam ask all the questions, Adam at Will asking all the questions, use that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Otherwise, I threaten to do so after the speakers are done. Our next presenter is Jennifer Johnson who's a senior policy. Are you senior? You're a border policy advisor to the Southern Border Communities Coalition. I have too many windows on my screen. The SBCC, Southern Borders Communities Coalition, is, as Jenny, I'm sure will explain better than I can, a network of border-based organizations working really to defend the rights of people in border communities. They've done really important work pushing for reforms, efforts to prevent migrant deaths, to identify remains, to get accountability for abuses, obviously. And as I'm sure Jenny will talk about, SBCC has led this year a strong effort to get Border Patrol to abolish its critical incident teams, which she'll explain. I've known Jennifer since she worked on Mexico human rights at the Latin America Working Group. It's always a pleasure to see you, and I'm handing off the microphone to you.
There, thanks so much, Adam, and thanks to Wola for this invitation for this really interesting conversation. I'm Jenny Johnson. Yes, I serve as the policy advisor for SBCC, the Southern Border Communities Coalition. We serve a coalition of groups, civil rights, human rights, humanitarian, environmental groups from San Diego to Brownsville, looking at the impact of border militarization on communities, as well as those who arrive, visitors, those who arrive to our border seeking safety. So when Adam proposed this conversation today, I took a few steps back, just thinking, how do we, and I'm going to talk about the critical incident teams, but I just was thinking, like, with all the challenges that the agency, Border Patrol, is facing, how did we get here? Zoe and Shaw referenced this broader culture of abuse and impunity and the systems in place that have fomented this. And of course, that can be the subject of many books and scholarship. So I'm just going to start off with a couple of comments about what has contributed to this current culture of abuse and impunity, unfortunately, at CBP. As referenced, Border Patrol, which, as we know, is one of the component agencies of CBP, was started in 1924. And it's an agency that really, the reason why it has sometimes this deeply entrenched culture of abuse and it's steeped in institutional racism is literally, its origins are as an agency developed to enforce racial boundaries. So inherently in dehumanizing border crossers. Moving ahead several decades to the 1990s, when the prevention through deterrence became the agency's dominant strategy to policing the border. And at that time, the US Border Patrol was really more kind of what we know of it being today, which is really ratcheted up a tremendously huge border militarization footprint, agents, resources increasing exponentially, including since that time, we've seen a 10-fold increase in the agency's overall budget and a 5-fold increase in the number of agents, even despite the well-documented reports of rampant human rights violations. So Congress really is providing tremendous amount of resources to this agency. But also a number of examples how Border Patrol kind of asserts or is even permitted to play by different set of rules than other law enforcement agencies. For example, in the past 2 decades since 9/11, the agency really has used the national security as a way to shield itself from external scrutiny. Another example, despite, I would say, a broad public consensus that racial profiling by the police is a bad idea, and federal law enforcement are prohibited from engaging in profiling based on race and ethnicity, there's a carve-out for Border Patrol. The Obama-era Department of Justice racial profiling guidance allows for an exception for Border Patrol and federal immigration interdiction activities in the vicinity of the border, which, as we know, is a very wide zone. That's not right at the border, but this wide zone of roughly 100 miles from land and maritime borders. These are just some of the factors when you think about the overall agency culture, also that contributes to culture of the regular rules don't apply. So I'm actually going to now move over to primarily focus my comments on a longstanding problematic institutionalized practice within the agency that has allowed impunity to fester. So as noted by previous speakers, there are many groups doing important work of doing abuse documentation and a really well-grounded reports of violence and harm inflicted on individuals in CBP custody, but many also have lost their lives. SDCC, we have a death tracker of those who have lost their lives in CBP custody since 2010. And we've documented at least 245 individuals. The majority of these who have lost their lives are Black and brown men, women, and children from the countries and regions of South America, Central America, Caribbean, North America, and Africa. And yet in the nearly 100 years, so that's just since 2010, 100-year history of the Border Patrol, not a single agent has been successfully convicted of a killing while on duty, which is a disturbing figure, 0. And this is not an accident, but really by design. For more than 3 decades, impunity can be directly tied to the interference of these unauthorized units of Border Patrol agents that are called Border Patrol Critical Incident Teams, also called Border Patrol Critical Incident Investigative Teams. They go by many names, but I think for the purposes of this discussion, I'll refer to them as Border Patrol CITs, Border Patrol Critical Incident Teams. Although the Border Patrol really attempted to keep the existence of these teams out of public view by excluding details about these units from government documents, the existence of Border Patrol CITs were revealed through public record requests, investigation by NGOs and advocates, agent disclosures, and litigation. And what was revealed through all of this is that CITs, or teams of Border Patrol agents, that conducted investigations following agent-involved critical incidents for
Are others hearing Jennifer? No. Okay. Let's give her another 10 seconds to see if she comes back. And if not, we will change the order of our presenters and I'll let her know. All right, we'll let her know when she comes back that don't you love Zoom? We'll let her know when she comes back that she was in the middle of explaining what critical incident teams are. But for now, unless she comes back while I'm introducing her, I guess not. I'll introduce Sarah Turberville from the Project on Government Oversight. Sarah runs the Constitution Project at POGO, which is a Washington-based organization that oversees the federal government. She'll be able to explain POGO's mission better than I can. But she coordinates the Constitution Project's public education and advocacy efforts on democratic institutions, separation of powers, protection of constitutional rights, and other similar issues, including immigration and surveillance. She covers the border, CBP, and DHS's oversight mechanisms, and has done quite a bit of work on the work of the Office of Inspector General as well. But I'll let her hand off to Sarah to talk about her work, which we greatly admire as well. Thanks for joining us, Sarah.
Thank you, Adam, for the invitation. And I'm sorry we lost Jenny. Maybe I can do a decent job of trying to pick up at least on some of these themes that she was discussing earlier in her remarks about the culture of impunity at CBP. But first, I should say that the Project on Government Oversight, we are definitely the newest entity to this space. And the advocacy that we've taken up would simply not be possible without the folks and organizations on this call and those who have been working along the border to document abuses and seek reform. And so thank you all, and thank you, Adam and Lola, for the invitation to speak today. At POGO, we work to achieve a more accountable, ethical federal government that adheres to constitutional principles. And most of our advocacy is directed at federal policymakers and officials. And for some time, one of the dimensions of this is focused on the government's abuse of its domestic policing and national security functions. And of course, CBP is like the confluence of those two things and those two justifications. I thought it might be helpful to take a step back a little bit and have sort of a bird's eye view of some of the things that Zoe and Shaw in particular were drilling down on. And what a lot of people don't realize is that CBP is the largest law enforcement agency in the country. It's larger, not just largest federal law enforcement, but largest law enforcement agency, full stop. And as many of these advocates have outlined today, it's also largely the least accountable, and that's because of this culture of impunity. And some of those I think Jenny covered well, like the rank corruption, from things like the critical incident teams to Congress throwing vast amounts of money at the agency without any strings attached to it, basically. And there's just a handful I wanted to maybe delve into a little more deeply. That, some are structural, legal, and bureaucratic. And of course, I think maybe the most obvious is the political, which I think is worth emphasizing. Some of this impunity is because I think it's proven incredibly effective for CBP and for our politicians to vilify immigrants and using immigration as a political cudgel. And so it's very hard to decouple Border Patrol impunity from the racist rhetoric coming from our leaders that often accompanies discussions about immigration. And so Republicans and even Democrats don't want to meaningfully take on systemic reform of this agency, notwithstanding the fact that we are, fundamentally, it's a law enforcement problem with CBP. And that's sort of the lens that we've been looking at this work through at POGO. Structurally, I think there's some unique problems too when it comes to accountability at CBP. And one of the questions that comes to mind is like, who is the constituency that would be clamoring to hold these agents accountable, right? Like inherently, these are largely folks with fewer rights that have been recognized by our courts. And as I think a former head of OPR said that if CBP or Border Patrol had been a major metropolitan law enforcement agency, they would have been under investigation by the Department of Justice for systemic violations of constitutional rights a long time ago. But we don't have that same kind of like citizenry that's able to really hold their elected officials to account when it comes to the operation of border enforcement law enforcement. And I think some of the structural challenges are also related to the utterly expansive jurisdiction of Border Patrol claims. As many of you know, 2/3 of Americans live in what Border Patrol says is the border zone, which is in US territory within 100 miles of a land or sea border. And that is simply too broad of a swath of space to operate in, to be able to keep eyes and ears on the conduct of the agents within that jurisdiction. And then finally, I'd just point out, as Zoe, you were commenting about DHS investigating itself is not, is that a great idea? But the one entity that is independent of CBP and that should be assuring accountability is Congress. But oversight by Congress is incredibly diffuse when it comes to the Department of Homeland Security. There's over 90 congressional committees or subcommittees with some kind of, that can claim some kind of jurisdiction over DHS, which, I think maybe the inverse way to look at that is to say that really there's no entity in Congress that is like consistently and robustly overseeing Customs and Border Protection. It does come in fits and starts, like scandals like family separation lead to congressional inquiry, but short of a major scandal, congressional oversight entities largely ignore CBP. And there have been very few of our leaders in Congress that have been willing to use their oversight perch to compel change or force responses on inquiries that they have about abuses at CBP. And I think a good example of how this could be done, but it's not done, is what Senator Ron Wyden did earlier in I don't know if we're going back to 2020 or 2021 at this point. Time is a construct. I've lost all conception of time, but Senator Wyden is chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and that is the entity that, for historical reasons, is actually charged with confirming the commissioner of CBP. And Senator Wyden delayed the confirmation of his own party's nominee for that agency until he got some answers from DHS on what federal agents did when they were stoking violence in Portland in the summer of 2020. But again, I think Wyden's use of his chairmanship to compel answers from CBP is more of the rare exception than the rule. The next sort of dimension of this impunity, I think, is legal, and that the law operates in a way to protect Border Patrol and foreclose meaningful accountability for its abuses. Hey, Jenny, I think we're just gonna let me, I was essentially expanding on some of your earlier themes about like the culture of impunity, and I think we can then turn back to you to continue the discussion about the CITs.
Thank you.
So the legal dimensions of this problem are that you know, the courts have essentially greenlit exceptions to constitutional protections that exist everywhere else in the country. And then when the agents operate in a way that violates people's rights, the law is now also operating in a way that essentially protects them from any kind of accountability. So we've got a Supreme Court that, you know, going back to the 70s, ruled that roving patrol stops can be made on a very, very low suspicion basis on a reasonable suspicion, which is, you know, any officer can come up with any justification to stop somebody based on that level of suspicion. And that those stops can be based on racial profiling. If this is done by Border Patrol in the name of immigration enforcement. And then we've also had a Supreme Court that's greenlit checkpoints well into the interior of the United States and has said that race can be, you know, this singular factor that, you know, permits a border enforcement agent to send somebody to secondary inspection. Like, these are things that would never fly within the interior of the United States if it was being done by, you know, state or local law enforcement, and rightly so, because the Constitution applies. And then the flip side of this is, how does the law operate to protect Border Patrol and foreclose meaningful accountability? And part of that is a loophole that exists for federal law enforcement. You know, if state and local law enforcement were to violate your rights, say they invade your home or use force against you or murder a family member, you would be able to haul them into court and to seek to have them held civilly liable for that abuse. But there's no corresponding federal law that guarantees a cause of action if that abuse is done by a federal law enforcement agent. And as many know, there was a case back in 1971, Bivens, where the Supreme Court held that, well, okay, we don't have a federal law that says you can sue a federal law enforcement agent, but you could sue directly under the Constitution, essentially. But since that time, the court has become hostile to its own precedent. And in a series of cases, it has essentially eviscerated the ability of those who are victims of federal law enforcement abuse to get their foot in the courthouse door, to sue those abusers and to seek accountability. It happened again just this last term in a case called Egbert v. Boole, which a Border Patrol agent entered the property of a US citizen and assaulted the plaintiff, and the court said, too bad, there's no remedy available. You know, this, far be it from us to question anything that's done in the name of national security. And this is on the heels of a couple of other cases that have really, you know, reduced the ability of individuals to seek redress when their rights are violated by a federal law enforcement official. And frequently, that federal law enforcement official is a Border Patrol agent. So there's this legal dimension. And then I think, as you know, so you well articulated, there's a huge bureaucratic component to this. The complaint and discipline process is opaque internally. People, you know, go to relive their trauma to file a complaint without ever knowing if anything will come of it. The complaints get shuffled around. And then all too often, CBP is just able to wait out the storm. You know, scandal happens, complaint filed, and it's so much time elapses because of the way the discipline process unfolds that, some of the evidence becomes stale, as Zoe pointed out in the case of Camilo. Nothing could be substantiated from what the complaint stated, because they could never then at that point interview Camilo, because it was 21 months later. And then should discipline actually come to pass, it can be reduced by leaders in the field. We saw this in the IM 1015 Facebook investigation. This was a place where Congress did actually investigate, which is great. The House Oversight and Reform Committee investigated last year and released their report. But there were 60 CBP agents who were found to have committed misconduct by posting, racist, sexist, threatening, violent images on Facebook. Nearly all of them had the recommended discipline reduced. 57 of them continue to work with migrants to this day. And notably, CBP was able to stall congressional oversight for nearly 18 months. And it wasn't until a new administration came in that they began to turn materials over to the House Oversight Committee back in the spring of 2021. And then I think, the last thing, I would be remiss not to talk about the Inspector General. I work at the Project on Government Oversight. We care a lot about IGs. These are entities that are meant to be an independent source of oversight to suss out possible abuse, waste, fraud, and abuse. And considering the ineffective and dysfunction of all the other avenues for accountability at CBP, the IG at DHS should be, plays a really important role. But in this case, we at POGO have been calling for the president to remove Joseph Kafari, the current IG of DHS, who was installed by President Trump, because he has really shown a shocking lack of independence and has frankly covered up abuses by DHS law enforcement, including CBP, contributing to the ongoing impunity that these officials enjoy. Back in April, my colleagues at POGO obtained a draft IG report that found that in 35 cases, primarily CBP agents, of these 35 cases, they were primarily CBP agents, had engaged in cases of domestic violence that had been substantiated. And in 30 of these cases, they were permitted to continue carrying their firearms. The worst cases of abuse were scrubbed from the final published IG report. And when discipline was handed down, the officers were suspended for only a short period of time. And the specifics of their misconduct often don't end up in their record, like violent abuse of a spouse. Instead, they sort of use these vague categorizations like conduct unbecoming, papering over the actual degree of misconduct found. In another unpublished report that we uncovered, over 10,000 DHS law enforcement employees reported experiencing sexual harassment and misconduct at work. And in some cases, DHS paid settlements without even investigating or disciplining the perpetrators. In one case, there was a woman who was paid almost $250,000 by DHS, but OPR was never brought into that investigation or discussion. And that perpetrator, I believe, remains employed by DHS to this day. So like the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And Kafari, frankly, is covering for all of them. And I guess I'll just end these remarks by, what we at POGO have really, what this investigation, I think, really brought home for us is that if this is how agents are treating their colleagues and their spouses, we worry greatly about what happens out of public view in this vast area that Border Patrol claims to be the border zone. And so I look forward to continuing this discussion, and I hope that was a useful kind of Washingtonian look at what's going on with the agency itself.
No, that was super useful, especially just it really highlights the challenges that reform efforts are going to face. Thank you so much, Sarah. And Jenny, when you clicked on that mysterious attachment and your computer crashed on you, I think that you were just starting to explain what Border Patrol critical incident teams are.
Yeah. I'm not sure what happened there. I'm so sorry. And so I'll try to jump back in as best as I can. So I think that I was discussing that one of, that we know that there's this, that we've documented, at least at SBCC, around 245 people who have lost their lives while in CBP custody since 2010. We know that the figure, obviously, in the 100-year history of the Border Patrol is much larger, yet not a single agent has been successfully convicted of killing while on duty. So looking into why is that the case, partners, and I want to, acknowledge, obviously, my partners at Alliance San Diego, as well as at the UC Berkeley Human Rights Clinic, of doing a lot of this research and working in some of these cases, is looking at, for more than 3 decades, that there's been this interference of these Border Patrol critical incident teams that go by many names. And what we know about them through, they were hidden, but through these record requests, litigation, agent disclosures, found out these are teams of Border Patrol agents that conducted investigations following agent-involved critical incidents for Border Patrol chiefs, the sector chiefs. So local, kind of that sector chief level involvement, obvious gross conflict of interest. The stated purpose, able to find in documents, was to mitigate the civil liability for agents, no known equivalent in other law enforcement agencies. They did not operate as independent investigators seeking facts. Instead, they really sought to exonerate agents. So not investigating, but just exonerating their fellow agents. So really acting as cover-up units. We do know that Congress grants authority to conduct criminal investigations of excessive use of force by border agents to the FBI, to the OIG, and in limited circumstances, CBP OPR, as well as obviously territorial jurisdiction, state and local law enforcement. But in no means anywhere does Congress ever granted that authority to the Border Patrol or any component of the Border Patrol, which is the Border Patrol critical incident teams. The case that really allowed, kind of to identify the, these patterns in this use of Border Patrol critical incident teams, these SIT teams, and the role they've played in corrupting investigations was in the case of Anastasio Hernandez Rojas. Definitely not an isolated case by any means, but really emblematic of the impunity perpetuated by SITs. For folks who are not familiar, Anastasio Hernandez Rojas, a longtime resident of San Diego, father of 5 U.S. citizen children, in May of 2010 was brutalized by border agents after asking for medical attention for his ankle that had been injured. And border agents initially described Anastasio as aggressive, standing and kicking an agent, but eyewitness videos later revealed that he was actually handcuffed and lying face down on the ground, surrounded by a dozen agents, and he was beaten, agents kneeled on his body, tased repeatedly, even after he had become unresponsive, thus causing his death. This brutality took place at the San Ysidro Port of Entry, south of San Diego, in view of members of the public on an overhead bridge. CBP immediately attempted to cover up the incident, disperse eyewitnesses, and erase their cell phone videos, with the notable exception of a woman who kept walking and then shared her cell phone footage over a year later. So in the case of Anastasio, CBP and the Border Patrol used a Border Patrol critical incident team to conceal, destroy, tamper with evidence to obstruct investigations. Among other activities, records indicate that SIT teams erased cell phone videos, intervened in autopsies, investigative interviews, destroyed videos, altered government documents, mishandled evidence, and acted basically at every turn to obstruct justice. These are agents engaged in the investigation of fellow agents. SIT teams also gave information to attorneys who were defending the border agents, the information that was not provided to San Diego Police Department for their investigative record and report for the prosecutors to review. So DOJ really relied on this false narrative and incomplete evidence, and when they declined to bring charges against the agents involved. They also failed to consider charges of obstruction of justice, an obstruction that has come into clear view with the revelation of the involvement of these SIT teams in Anastasio's case. I want to say also that instead of being scrutinized, we've seen that members of the SIT teams have actually gotten promotions. Most notable in the case of Anastasio was Rodney Scott, who was the acting chief of the San Diego Border Patrol at the time and went on to become the U.S. Border Patrol chief. Because of this egregious miscarriage of justice, which includes not only failure to bring charges against the agents, but also attempted cover-up by law enforcement, Anastasio's family has brought their case before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which will be holding a hearing this November 4th to determine if the U.S. law enforcement officials use the power of the state to kill Anastasio, cover it up, and deny the family access to justice. This case is being also worked, the family is working with Alliance San Diego and again, the UC Berkeley human rights legal team. This will be a landmark case. That's the first known extrajudicial killing case that will be decided by the IACHR, an American Commission involving US law enforcement. So SBCC brought these Border Patrol SIT teams to light in a letter to Congress in October 2021, prompting congressional inquiries and call for Congress of a GAO investigation. And those are still underway. Later, responding to pressure and dialogue, CBP Commissioner Magnus did issue a memo in May 2022 announcing the elimination of these SIT teams and transferring the task of response and processing of critical incident scenes to CBP's Office of Professional Responsibility. So outside Border Patrol over to OPR. And that was supposed to have taken place by October 1st, 2022. OPR is also funded to bring on as many as 350 new personnel, investigators on board for this function. But we are concerned about what is happening in terms of accountability for the past. To date, there's been no comprehensive independent review of the cases in which Border Patrol SITs were interfered. And we are very concerned that CBP OPR, while they are hiring, may be hiring the very same Border Patrol agents who are involved in SIT teams. So really to strengthen the integrity, its own integrity, OPR should seek to hire people from outside Border Patrol SITs who aren't tainted by the bias inherent in the role that SIT teams played to mitigate liability, as it's never appropriate for an investigator to play that role. It's absolutely essential to fully account for all of the harm done by SITs over the past 3 decades and ensure an independent review of these cases in which they may have interfered and obstructed justice, as well as the agents, as identify the agents, supervisors, and chiefs who are involved in these unlawful acts in these unlawful units. So that is, I think, wrapping up my comments about Border Patrol critical incident teams.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Thanks to all of you. And we have about 12 minutes for questions. I want to be judicious of your time. I want to be judicious of it. Also, you'll see that number of participants start to shrink as we hit 2:30. Let me take, we have some good questions in the Q&A, and let me take these. And also what we'll do, I'll give each of you 2-3 minutes to try to respond as much as possible to these questions, and also anything else you want to say in closing as we go to closing. And we'll go in the order in which people spoke. So we'll see Shaw again first. But in general, just sort of summarizing what I see here. I mean, one, there's a reference to the Patriot Act. I would also add a reference to the Homeland Security Act. CBP was born without much oversight or much of a discipline system attached to it. Things have been added on since 2003, but it still seems, as you've described, something very Byzantine and Kafkaesque. If you were to go to congressional appropriators, would you say throw more money at the existing system of oversight agencies? Is it this that they don't have the bandwidth and they have too high caseloads and just need more resources, or is it a lot more than that? I think I know how you'll answer that, but please, it'd be good to hear about that. There was a question about whether CITs were really sunsetted by the end of the fiscal year, and also the extent to which people's fellow agents or former agents at OPR are actually going to be the ones now still in charge of these investigations, and do we think things are going to change? There was a good question just about border-wide, if we have a sense about serious patterns of abuse, sectors or stations perhaps that are sort of notorious or have a lot of complaints against them. Do we have even completed enough reporting to know about that? And I would add, what about particularly fatalities when you don't have a witness who can really talk about whether proper procedures were used? I think of the October 4th, there was an incident, for instance, in the Isleta station outside of El Paso, where somebody wielding scissors was fatally shot. And was that the proper way to do it? We won't probably ever know, but what do we know about cases like that? In addition to cases of just everyday abuse, ranging from theft of belongings to dangerous night expulsions So, even what we saw in Del Rio, the aggressive behavior. And finally, a really good question was, you don't have to answer all of these. They're just things I'm throwing out. The really good one was, how serious is Secretary Mayorkas taking this? Is the Biden administration really taking on cultural change and accountability? Do they have the political will or even political space to do more? Can they? And should we do they need more, shall we say, encouragement? So go ahead, Shah, and I'll make like hand motions when it's about 2.5 or 3 minutes.
Those are a lot of questions, and maybe you can remind me of some of them as we go through. I'll go back to the legislative asks. I think that, obviously the demand is certainly not to continue to blindly throw funds at the agency and at dysfunctional systems. I think legislative solutions are important, are needed and could be done in ways that are addressing the gaps and problems with the existing offices. We've also seen a trend of kind of pieces of legislation proposing completely new offices and just adding new pieces to that kind of complicated overlapping system that we discussed. And I don't know that that's necessarily the solution either, but addressing things like we talked about, the transparency of what recommendations are being made by these agencies. You could put some additional requirements into legislation about the agency following those recommendations or taking steps to address them. You could have requirements for public transparency. I know there's also been bills proposed that try to take on some of the kind of systemic problems within the disciplinary system, and taking kind of making structural changes to that system to try and increase uniformity and legitimate outcomes from the disciplinary process. So I think those are legislative changes. Perhaps there is an argument to be made, and I don't know. It'd be interesting if somebody has studied this, or if it's something that somebody, including us, maybe should take on, is kind of looking at proportionally what is an appropriate internal affairs, the appropriate size of an internal affairs office proportionate to an agency of this size. It may very well be that OPR is massively understaffed, underfunded to be reasonably expected to, conduct a high standard of internal investigations. And I'm sure there's some comparators to kind of the size of internal affairs offices in other agencies, or kind of policing experts that we could call on to inform around kind of what the appropriate budget and size of an internal affairs office. I'm assuming it should be large for the largest law enforcement agency in the country. The other way to go about it, of course, is to cut the number of agents and jurisdiction of the agency itself, which are recommendations that the ACLU has put forward both to the administration and congressionally. There really is no need for the number of Border Patrol agents. The agency's operating with well over double the number of agents, and I think triple the budget that it started with. Even at a time in the early 2000s when it began under DHS, it was apprehending the same number of people as today, and those were people actively, the vast majority actively trying to avoid apprehension. And today, people are just coming across and turning themselves into the agency. And so I think there's a real argument to be made that the agency is unnecessary in size, and so shrinking that would also, provide better ability for internal oversight agencies like OPR at its current size to conduct reasonable oversight. I think on just one more question I'll address is the issue of kind of who's being hired and how those people can be expected to, I think that the bigger concern or the focus should be on creating a system in which investigations are transparent enough that is not a primary factor or an outcome determinative factor, right? That there is transparency and understanding about what agents are being trained on, and then that those investigations are ultimately released to the public, that there are internal quality control checks, third-party quality control checks, so that investigations, even if they are being conducted by a former member of a critical incident team, are less likely to carry the bias that may have been carried with that person serving in a role under a different leadership structure and a different reporting structure. And so I think it is a fair and concern to raise, and one that we should continue to raise, and that the OPR should be striving to hire as many independent people that aren't kind of tainted with that at least perception of misconduct in the past. But at the same time, the ultimate goal should be a system where that kind of internal oversight and quality control over investigations, doesn't allow for an agent who may be seeking to protect his buddies within the agency to do so. And anything short of that, I think is a failure of an internal oversight system, and one that, we should be working towards that being the goal. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That's great. We it looks like we may run about 5 minutes late. If anybody needs to go by like 2:30 sharp, raise your hand and I'll let you go next. Otherwise, I'll turn to Zoe and let us go over time.
Okay, I'll go ahead. I'll keep it short anyway. I think I spoke plenty before, but yeah, I appreciate Shah's responses, and I think I'll focus a little bit more on the question about kind of patterns of abuse, or what types of abuse are we seeing, where do we see it happening. I think it's a great question, and as far as I know, we don't really have right now like a systemic border-wide, besides what WOLA is doing in collecting what we know, but right, we don't have multiple organizations in every sector along the border who are able to do and who have the capacity to do this complaint work. Like, there's just so much we don't know. That's what I'm trying to say. So it's hard to even say, certain sectors, certain geographic areas are where things are happening primarily. It's something that I just don't know right now. So I can speak a little bit just to KBI, because what we see based on our geographic location is really the Tucson sector and some from the Yuma sector as well. And so what I've been looking through our complaints just from the past 2 years, I can kind of point out to you, the most common things that we've made complaints about. Definitely the first one being the due process violations that I had spoken to. Just the outright denial of any fear interviews, or assessing in greater depth the fear that people have. Medical neglect is also one of the top categories of being denied medical care while in Border Patrol detention or in Border Patrol custody. And then after that, the two top categories would be the physical abuse, excessive force, like some of the examples that I gave, and just overall inhumane detention conditions while in CBP custody. So those are like our top, just numerically, but it's always with the caveat of there's so many abuses that are not being reported. There are so many reasons people don't want to report them. Like I said, a system that does not feel particularly empowering to an individual. So that's a big challenge as well. And then I'll just point out also, as far as a pattern, the confiscation and non-return of personal belongings. It's not something that I had brought up specifically, but it's something that we at KBI and so many other organizations are seeing and documenting, and is an example of kind of maybe this like everyday abuse, right? Maybe people don't consider that very egregious, right, maybe it doesn't have life or death consequences like some other abuses, but it's something that we're seeing so often. And, in Nogales, people being deported who are Mexican nationals and then have no identification, no Mexican identification, no money, no cell phones, so no way to contact family members or loved ones. So that's something else that I just want to uplift, is something that we're seeing a lot. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. And just parenthetically, the fact that, we have pretty good information about what's happening in the Nogales and Yuma, or Tucson and Yuma areas, in great part thanks to KBI. There are parts of the border that are just a black hole where we don't even know what we don't know. And in the absence of a functioning complaint system, just a note to philanthropists who might be watching this, it would be great to have more support for organizations doing this work in other parts of the border. So go ahead, Jenny.
Hi, I think that I would chime in and just agree. I think what is not needed is more funding for Border Patrol writ large. We have seen this massive expansion of funding of agents, equipment. I mean, we didn't even really get into a conversation about like the expansion of surveillance technologies in the region and concerns and complaints about that. But I think also just taking a much bigger look at what resources are needed at the border in terms of looking at what are the populations arriving seeking safety, and not just always allowing the agency to get more and more and more under this kind of guise of national security. And I think really trying to, I know there's a lot of conversations in advocacy circles about what is a functioning system that of border management, not, of true, rights respecting border management that is, meeting the needs of people arriving seeking safety. And does Border Patrol fit into that? Or really do we need people with other areas of expertise, to be serving in those roles to create that kind of system? I realize that's like a long term and maybe a little pie in the sky, but I do think that it's a really important conversation to be had, not more agents, more surveillance, et cetera. I other think, a conversation in terms of addressing some of the things, I think whereas we do need these accountability mechanisms, I also think looking at the places and spaces in which Border Patrol operations, there are these abuses occurring, and one of them is checkpoints. Internal checkpoints we know operate well into the interior of the country. Many people who are U.S. citizens, who are border community residents, come in contact with agents at those, and we know that research shows that the vast majority of there's U.S. citizens who have been apprehended for small quantities of marijuana possession at those. And I think even though it uses a large percentage of overall, I think it's around 10% or thereabouts of personnel. So I think really looking at where are some of these operations contributing to more abuses and just more kind of the militarization of the region. The last piece I think is obviously transparency. We know that we've heard from various administration officials the importance of transparency, and we've seen real delays in the release of data from the agency, the collection and release of data. I know that we as advocates have, concerns about the quality of some of the data, but I think it's exceptionally important that the agency is public, when they have made commitments to make data public, to make that publicly available, and to track various, I'm thinking mainly of migrant deaths, I believe that that data has not been released, even for FY21 as of yet, but I think making sure the transparency piece. I think those are some of my main thoughts at the moment.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, let's uplift that, the need for both legislation to require more reporting, as Zoe had mentioned in her remarks, but also, that migrant deaths report that was in the Missing Persons Act of 2020 was due December 31st, 2021, and we still haven't seen it. Sarah, you have the final word for today, at least.
I think maybe I'll just answer the question about if there's more that the Biden administration needs to do, and that's unequivocally yes. The president needs to remove Joseph Kafari as the IG of DHS. He has proven that he is incapable of carrying out that critically important function independently and with integrity. There's more that could be done through executive action to improve things like data collection, right? We could, Kirsten Gillibrand had a bill that would require far more robust data collection on stops, for example, that are made by Border Patrol, that could just as easily be a policy that is rolled out by Secretary Mayorkas. So, I think that we need to look for places like that, because, without sort of knowing the full extent of the problem with respect to maybe racial profiling, whatever, it becomes very difficult to develop, the appropriate remedy. And then finally, I feel like the administration just is not understanding the threat that CBP poses, not just to the safety of people crossing the border and migrants, but also to people within the interior of the United States and citizens alike. We only need to look at Portland and the subsequent massive surveillance that CBP undertook of multiple cities of protesters that were simply, protesting against police violence. That was marshaled by the prior administration to get a preview of how this agency could be misused and abused under a more authoritarian president. So essentially, I think there's a whole lot of good reasons for the administration to take seriously the abuses and the need to rein in, and the many ways that my co-panelists have described here at the end of the call, to rein in this agency.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to all of the speakers. You've been so generous with your time today. It was just great to get this all in the record, get this up on YouTube. We'll have a transcript out as well with key points. And we just need to keep hammering away at all this stuff. But it was just, it's unfortunately rare that we've had, I mean, we don't have enough of these public events. We hope to do more of these. I hope actually in the next couple of weeks to round up and then schedule an event with authors of recent books. There has been some good book length things written in the past year or two about this, some of them memoirs, some of them more social science, and it'd be great to have all of those folks together. But for now, I'm going to say goodbye and let everybody get back to work, the great work that you're doing, and back to your days. And thanks to all of the dozens of people who joined us on this event, which will be up on YouTube shortly. Have a good rest of your day.